Skeptic, resuming our scientific presentation series in geometry predominantly, and we are recovering our trail into the heart of the universe in quantum mechanics using a geometry that has been shown to me. Uh, I have to put it that way because spherical geometry is unknown in science currently. Instead of spherical geometry proper, we have to use our linear system, the only geometric system available to science throughout history to the present day. Because in the 20th century we discovered that everything in the universe on a statistical basis is pure spherical geometry, it's obvious that science was destined to encounter this limit in our application of the linear system, which we inherited from the Greeks essentially, and it's now time to endure evolution. As you know, I have a vendetta against the science cartel, which has been actively promoting a virulent lie about biological evolution, which has no reality whatsoever. But there is such a thing as evolution. We can see it in science. It is possible to evolve, but only as individuals, except in the collective sense of passing on knowledge and hopefully understanding, although of course knowledge has to be communicated in order for it to be useful to further generations, and the understanding must be resynthesized in the minds of upcoming generations. That is a process of evolution. That is the only correct use of the term evolution. As for biology, it is necessary because this is at the heart of deception. This is my own evaluative system, which I've applied since the age of 17, to the concept of biological evolution according to an imaginary process of natural selection, according to a mythicized man named Charles Darwin. Now, if you would like to get the history of this extremely evil pseudoscientific idea, you can get, this is the only source of this information that I know of, but it is adequate, and you can get a full comprehension of the lie of natural selection through reading the last book ever produced by Tom Wolfe. Now, for you literature fans, you know who Tom Wolfe is. If you're unfamiliar with that name, or if you think that I'm referring to Thomas Wolfe, who was a fiction writer of the 1920s and 30s, I believe, that's not the same man. Tom Wolfe wrote The Right Stuff. He also wrote The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and several other incisive essays. He's from the East Coast and he dresses like a dandy, or whatever you want to call it, but he's a most interesting man. I highly respect Tom Wolfe. He is deceased. He died just within the past few years. He died in this millennium. And his book is called The Kingdom of Speech, which does not, at least to me, sound like it's about evolution, but it is. Besides getting a thorough overview of the greatest lie ever foisted on modern man and modern society, you also get a keen insight into East Coast scientific politics. And Noam Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, I believe, is how he hears it pronounced most often. Noam Chomsky is a very highly respected man, and I do respect him. However, as a high-profile figure, he, too, can be indicted for certain prejudices and misalignments of his own mind with reality. Noam is an incisive critic of America as a government, as a threat to the world, and as such he's an extraordinarily valuable commentator who is still active out on the internet. He is very old and he looks that way, but his mind is as sharp as it ever was. Now, in Tom Wolfe's book, The Kingdom of Speech, Noam Chomsky comes up in context of the title theme, which is speech, and in terms, though, of evolution. That there was a highly active debate going on. I won't date this, but it was several decades ago when evolution was really, really picking up the pace in indoctrinating, brainwashing, and really terrorizing the rational world with its insane notion of descent from the apes. That we're from the African savanna and we were primates and then evolved according to the natural selection scheme outlined by Darwin. But in processing this information to make the deception truly virulent and infective and against science and against humanity, the notion of evolution as a valid framework for evaluating practically anything in the human equation was reaching a sort of climax, or I guess you could say blitzkrieg, where all we heard about, and of course this is still going on today, but at the time it was picking up the pace and it was deemed necessary by whatever power, supernatural or otherwise, is responsible for such a massive group mind, group think conversion to Satanism, or whatever less offensive name you choose, but a hideous, hideous blight on science and on the American intellectual landscape. Noam Chomsky was an advocate for part of this propagandistic system. As with anything human, you have to compartmentalize a bit in order not to indict a man for everything he's ever done as if it's pure evil and pure good. That's never really the case, or very rarely. You have a controversial issue which is black and white. The nature of deception is that of including truth with the lies in order to get over the lies. That's deception. It's meant to harm. Now, natural selection is very difficult to talk about with evolutionists. Because of their brainwashing, they're incapable of thinking straight. And I've noticed this over the decades throughout my life since the age of 17. So I'm no stranger to this phenomenon, and not at all wishing to be prejudicial. That's anti-scientific to be prejudicial. But one can seem to be prejudiced, and I think I will seem this way to you, if indeed you're still even remotely convinced that evolution is natural in any way. The nature of Darwinianism needs to be tracked and traced from its origin, and Tom Wolfe does an excellent job of that. The milieu in which Darwin existed was, of course, a time of tremendous scientific progress, and there are associated movements which one can study and perhaps develop a thesis about. Noam Chomsky, of course, was part of that. This would be in the 60s and 70s and beyond. It goes back further, of course. But when you go back to the time of Charles Darwin, the situation in human culture or civilization or society, scientific views, it was a time of tremendous transition out of essentially what we call the Dark Ages. And it's just the nature of how history influences. It's an historical development that has roots and then results. But in analyzing any period of time, it's always best to see the transition in the case of such an upheaval as what occurred in the 19th century after Darwin's publication of his book on the origin of species. What Darwin was doing was a definite scientific adventure. He was not a philosopher by any stretch of the imagination. He was a legitimate and highly respectable hands-on scientist who risked his life traveling all over the world. His most famous journey was on the Beagle to get to the Galapagos Islands, where he studied what he ended up calling the diversification of species. So it's necessary there to see what Darwin perceived. And here, just for a healthy perspective, it's necessary for us, since we have the capability of this perspective now, to see what Darwin could not see. And it can be summarized in 3 letters: DNA. DNA. I've in past lectures stated that the DNA discoveries that were significant in prosecuting the established theory of evolution, that those discoveries occurred in the 60s and 70s. I was off by a decade because really it was Watson and Crick that are given at least as a benchmark. Of course, science progresses, and all they did was discover the double helix structure of DNA. But that is marked, and I think, well, legitimately so in terms of benchmarks, as the turning point in the study of the human genetic system. That's the one we're interested in most, but really just the genetic system of cellular organisms. All creatures in the ecology are cellular organisms. That is the only relationship we bear with the other species, if you want to put it that way. We could be considered a species because we are cellular organisms. However, even that has been overturned, and this is a monumental reversal of the trend that was occurring in the 19th century. As I say, it's best to view that in just a broad stroke, first pass approach to this topic of genetic evolution, that at that time in the 19th century, basically humanity was emerging from the Dark Ages, which was characterized, I would say rather legitimately so, as a time of religious oppression. And religion got a very, very bad name from the oppressions of, it's often attributed to the Vatican Church. I would say that's another valid benchmark as such. But essentially is just another group mind phenomenon. And Catholicism was a political movement, which of course dominated Europe for centuries. And it was marked with extreme injustice, extreme prejudice, just a loathsome situation of inhibition and oppression and extortion. The Catholic Church was after money, because to call it a church is really a misnomer. It may be called a church today in terms of just a blanketing term for anything that looks like a church. The Catholic Church does look like a church. But the Catholic organization, like all man-made group minds, runs off by itself and forms a tyrannical system, which in the case of religion mixed with politics is the worst of all possible situations. That situation is now being reduplicated for us in Israel, which pretends to have a religious and even perhaps a moral injunction to impose the Zionist nation on an innocent people who had nothing to do with the situation in Europe, such as Hitler was pushing forward to get rid of the Jews. And I've covered that. You do need to have some kind of rational perspective on what Hitler and Nazi Germany were doing when they came up with this insane idea of a final solution. It had originated in Hitler's mind in his Vienna days when he was right at the right time to see the Zionist movement start to become militant. And it began basically with Marx, Karl Marx, who is still a respected scholar by many people who detest Zionism. But essentially, Marx gave the signal to the Zionists that they certainly had a military option, that they had a perhaps moral injunction to go forward with their plan for the reestablishment of the Zionist state. Now, I've covered recently the origin of the Zionist state. It's not very commonly brought up because religion is a taboo subject. Even when attempting to indict the Israeli government, which obviously has a religious aspect to it, nobody wants to hear that. Certainly, the Zionists don't want to hear that. But also, it arouses Holocaust guilt, that anything you say against Zionism is basically going to be interpreted as anti-Semitic, and if you can somehow get past that and still be trying to prosecute the Zionist state, then you come up against ethical principles of the necessity to save the poor Jews who literally were wandering over Europe after World War II, having been freed from their Nazi oppressors, those who survived. But Zionism was already well underway, and the Zionists had already been methodically buying up land in what then was, I believe, British-controlled Arab territory. This was for the purpose of reestablishing the state. So this had a tremendous machination behind it. And the conspiracy theorists have been trying to deal with this for decades. But now the cat is out of the bag. There's no doubt at all about there was a conspiracy, because there's no way that Israel could have been reinstated on the map of the world without a concerted mobilization of many, many forces. It required some kind of supermind to coordinate that movement, the Zionist movement. The Jews had been sufficiently humiliated and decimated, so they were willing to listen to the Zionists much more than they had in the past. Most Jews, I think it's safe to say, I don't think anybody would disagree with this, they're just trying to assimilate and be normal people, perhaps still carrying on their ancient pseudo-religion. Judaism is not a valid religion. All it is a reflection of a people that were dispossessed. And whether or not you believe the Bible certainly corroborates the world events that led to the dissolution of the centuries-old Israeli nation. By the time of Yeshua, that is the one that Americans call Jesus Christ, by the time of Christ's crucifixion, the Israelis had already been deported from Israel centuries before by, I believe it was the Assyrians. But there were two deportations. The first one was of the 10 tribes of Israel that were in the northern part of Israel at that time, and they were taken away and never heard of again. A most remarkable fact of history, of course, completely taboo now. Nobody talks about that. Not even religious people talk about that. Christians don't touch it. The Jews, of course, won't touch it, but nobody touches it. But nevertheless, that's what happened. Disregarding Benjamino, who is a minor tribe, essentially all of Israel was deported and never came back. And then Judah was left, and then they were invaded. I believe it was by the Babylonians, but they were deported. And that's where at least a couple of the prophets, I'll just put it that way, more than one prophet, Ezekiel was one of them, issued their prophecies, which are in the Bible now, out of captivity. They were under captivity when that happened. And then if you know history or the Bible, you know that under a later ruler, Cyrus, I think is how that's pronounced, he issued a decree to let the Jews return to their homeland. And then they were released from captivity and they returned and reoccupied their former nation, which then would be called Judah. Not Israel, but Judah. And this is where we get the word Jew. It refers to a Yehudi or a Yehudin. And none of this is anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism is illogical, irrational, immoral, and just plain stupid. There is no such real thing as anti-Semitism except in a pathological sense. So I don't like to bring up the topic of anti-Semitism because now it's being used propagandistically in order to defend the Zionist state. So now that the Zionist state is back on the map, we have the situation we have in the world today. Now the parallel that I'm drawing is, although this may seem a bit far-fetched, I hope you do see the thread that natural selection is of course the only theory of our origins now, both as a human race and the ecology. The diverse species, of which there are millions of species. It's very important to know what a species is. And this is where we pick up the thread of Darwinianism, so-called. Darwin, in his journey to the Galapagos Islands, discovered that the finches had diversified on the island. And I don't think that can be denied. There was some sort of diversification because the finches can be proved to be all of the same type, that is, finches, but among the finches are a diversification of species where their beaks are changed and various aspects of their physiology are clearly altered from a prototype. So that would be a good piece of evidence to support biological evolution. Now, what Darwin did, without knowing anything about DNA, DNA was an unknown idea. Nobody knew how a new organism could grow and become the next generation of any species. That is, the nature of genetic transmission was completely unknown. We take it for granted now that we know about DNA transmission from one generation to the next. That is what was discovered beginning with Watson and Crick. Now, the way Noam Chomsky fits into this, not meaning to digress in all directions, but to give a big picture of what I'm talking about, Noam Chomsky took up his cudgels against a certain theoretical approach to human speech, that the dominant model, which by then was, of course, natural selection, suggests that the way to analyze the evolution of human speech was in context. Excuse me, I have asthma and I apologize for that noise. That human speech could be scientifically understood, how we got speech, by analyzing how humans descended from the animals. And Noam Chomsky sided with that, essentially. Whereas Tom Wolfe shows that there had been studies conducted, the time frame is now, I believe, the 60s and 70s, perhaps a little later, but not that long ago, just a few decades ago, where legitimate studies of the speech patterns of so-called primitive cultures had been published poking a hole in the main thesis of natural selection explanatory measures for how we got speech. Essentially, it was shown that that model of the evolution of human speech was ridiculous, and Noam Chomsky came out against the counter evidence, and Tom Wolfe brings that out very clearly in his book. Not at all flattering to Noam Chomsky. So that, I hope, gives you a clue as to how a man can be otherwise on a good track. That is, Noam has always criticized the American government, and he's highly valued for that service, which is a service, for the same reason that Helen Hunt Jackson's book on the decimation and persecution and really the genocidal effort against the Native Americans by the early American Republic was so reprehensible as to really disqualify the United States for membership among the nations. But then you would have to add, if you check the other nations, America was no different from any other nation. Now that is the justification being given by the Zionists. This would be Israel, and I'm referring to their government, not so much to the people, but the government. And it's not, strictly speaking, the people of Israel, no more than the people of America, were responsible for genocide. That's always a mistake, to pin the sins of the government on the people of the nation, who are really just victims, whatever they think about themselves. What's truly disturbing, even to me, and I'm pretty hardened against any kind of sympathy for genocide, but it's been pointed out cogently and by more than one study, even undertaken within Israel by Israelis of their own people. How do they feel about the genocidal campaign of the Zionist government against the Palestinian people of Gaza? How do they feel about the actions of their own government? Well, they don't really have a Helen Hunt Jackson among them. The only source of critique comes from outside of Israel. It's actually forbidden inside of Israel to critique the government. Unless you're at Hebrew University, this has been done. But except for some kind of internal protection within the system, in this case in Israel, it is not allowed to criticize the government in their genocidal campaign. So you're not going to get too much introspection in Israel, because every study has indicated that most of the people of Israel don't think the genocide is going fast enough. Essentially, they've been brainwashed by their government for decades now to consider the Palestinians to basically be exactly the same thing as Hamas. That when they say Hamas, who committed quite an atrocity back in, I believe it was it October 7th of last year, that they murdered, they came out of Gaza. This was a Hamas attack force that penetrated the Israeli defense line and got well inside of Israeli territory and committed atrocities. Now, numerically, this is insignificant compared to what was done to them systematically over a period of decades. And so it is important to point out that Hamas is a natural reaction to Israeli oppression, but nobody can condone acts of atrocity against civilians. And so Hamas, of course, is guilty of major war crime. This could not be brought before the UN, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, because Hamas is not a nation. So the only indictment against Hamas is in the form of Israeli genocide. That is, to get rid of all the people who are considered to be identical with Hamas. And this is the nature of the, I guess you'd call it, self-deception of the Israeli people, who of course are threatened. They are severely threatened by Hamas. And Hamas gives two versions of their story. Not so much in front of the world do they disclose their truly ingrained intent, and this is counteractive to the Zionist oppression, but essentially they want the Jews out of Israel. And world opinion on this, due to, I'll just say, general propaganda, just general brainwashing, is that Israel has a right to exist de facto, no matter how they stole the land and no matter what they did to extend their land. It was because of Arab hatred of the Jews. It has been correctly pointed out that even though there is definitely a strain of anti-Semitism among the Arabs, that is not at all the right way to view their military actions. What they were trying to get rid of was a Western imperialist incursion into their legitimate territory. This was enforced by both the Soviet Union and the United States. England, of course, went along with it, and really just kept injecting Jews into the territory until a conflict was inevitable. This was the plan of the Zionists, and nobody doubts that who knows history, that the Zionists engineered this war in order to forcibly take all the land away from the natural, legitimate inhabitants by whatever means, which they, in their internal Zionist writings, which are, of course, public now, any way they could, any way they had to, but stopping short of nothing. In other words, genocide. Inevitable. It just absolutely was inevitable. From the inception of the Zionist state, really beginning back in the 20s and 30s, but then after World War II, with the really virtually gypsy population of dispossessed Jews wandering around Europe looking for anywhere to live, to just be normal again, they were, of course, invited to Israel. You could say that was planned, but if so, that's a major conspiracy. The Bible supports that absolutely, but nobody in their right mind, unless they know some, I would have to put it, relatively secret information about this vast conspiracy, nobody could be expected to go along with the idea that the German genocide against the Jews was actually part of the Zionist plan. I'm just going to tell you, yes, it was. That was definitely engineered by the Zionists themselves, who have no interest in the Jews as such. What they're interested in, whether as Jews or as Satan worshippers, whatever they are communists, and they are the ones who engineered the Russian Revolution, resulting in the greatest mass genocide in the history of the world. That was the communist domination of both Russia and then after World War II, Eastern Europe. Those lands were absolutely, it's unthinkable. Alexander Solzhenitsyn brings that out in his Nobel Prize winning trilogy, The Gulag Archipelago. And Zionism is the direct descendant of communism. So that's the political arm of Zionism. Its roots are in genocide. Genocide marks the path of Zionism. And you can think of Zionism that way It's a genocidal political organization. This goes back at least 2,000 years. So whether or not you accredit all of the information I just provided to you, it's extremely important that you know that information. You may violently disagree with it. That's up to you. I can't control your reaction. What I can control, very limitedly, I'm just one man without really even a following, but I will give all the information so that you can make your decision. So that is a parallel to the situation in science. Now, natural selection, which I detest, as you know, is a similar evolution. It's an evolutionary process that describes the evolution of the theory of evolution. And this is the level of confusion now that I would say the entire scientific world has been hoodwinked, and nobody can escape the hegemony, if I'm using that word right. The dictatorial aspect of science now is that if you don't accept natural selection evolution, you cannot be a scientist. But if you do accept natural selection evolution, you cannot believe in God. That is the dogma. And nobody can argue with me on that. To be a scientist, you cannot believe in God. Because if you do believe in God, it means you're trying to undermine evolution. That is biological natural selection theory. So what happened basically after the discoveries of Watson and Crick is that microscopy advanced, the electron microscope was developed, and a worldwide sponsored campaign for studying genetics was promoted primarily by the United States government, who wanted biological weaponry. That is still being advanced, is still on the front burners of their massive stove to dominate the world. The United States has envisioned, as part of its manifest destiny propaganda, that only the United States deserves to rule the world in the name of democracy, which obviously is a sham. So we have essentially something like the Zionists in what we would call Washington, D.C. Actually, it's much more serious than that, as I have explained carefully over the past month in several lectures, actually the past 3 months. So we have a dire world situation, but I look at this from the point of view of science. I hope I've convinced you that my aspect on science is well grounded in a general trend on the face of the world, which is now interconnected in a way which could not have been envisioned even as long ago as the 1970s. Nobody could have foreseen the rise of the internet and such social media platforms, as you could name them all, but I'll just say YouTube is one of them. I'm using YouTube for its good purpose, which is as a platform for the dissemination of corrective information to correct the psychosis that's in the world now for any scientist who wishes to get out of the trap. Biological evolution has been disproved, and this is how it was done. Since Darwin did not know about DNA, he could not give a scientific explanation for the diversification of species. And therefore he did what I believe any scientist might do, is he offered a theory, and he called it a theory. What's not commonly reported anymore, although it was in the 60s, the valid objection to Darwinianism. I'll just continue to call it natural selection because that refers to the mechanism which actually does not exist. That's going to be the point of this thesis, is that Darwin, without knowing anything about DNA, formulated a theory. This is a reasonable thing to do, but it's a theory. But even in his book, which I continue to call The Descent of Species, the title is actually longer than that, of his famous book, he had a chapter called Problems with a Theory. So he was well aware of the problems in his theory even before he knew anything about DNA, but he guessed. In other words, I consider Charles Darwin to be a legitimate and respectable scientist. I don't think he did anything wrong. He naturally wanted to promote his theory in order for financial gain, but that's just the way of the world. I don't believe that he was prejudiced. He might have been, and perhaps psychologists can figure that out, but I don't think so. Because of his chapter, Problems with the Theory, which I went over with a fine-toothed comb, which had been done before, because when the creationists brought this up, of course the creationists were destined to lose this confrontation with the emerging model. That is, the final validation of the model, even in the face of DNA discoveries. So what were those? In short, it was discovered, subsequent to Watson and Crick, that the genetic code for any species is a locked code. That is, they don't change, and that has been proved. A species remains a species and cannot change. Well, that's a direct contradiction to the theory of natural selection. There's no such thing as natural selection. There's nothing to select. Now, those who know about genetic mutations offer a counter-argument, and this is the only counter-argument to the objection of science to that theory. They say that because mutations can be passed along, therefore the mechanism has been discovered for natural selection. Well, that can't be true because it's never been shown that a genetic mutation is advantageous. In fact, it has been shown that genetic mutations are at best neutral. They never result in a improvement in the organism, in the species. In other words, there's no such thing as species mutation. Species don't change. They can't change. It's impossible. That's a fact. So then you're stuck with a really difficult problem, because the question that human beings are asking, all of us are asking this, no matter what your opinion is, the question being asked is, how did the species diversify? Including, how did man emerge from the cellular organism structure? So there's really two questions at which you could consider one question. And to simplify it, it's simply the diversification of species. Well, since there's no such thing, that genetic codes are locked, where did they come from? And that is impossible to answer mechanistically. It cannot be answered mechanistically. We don't know. Well, unfortunately, in science, you're really not allowed to say that you don't know. Because if you don't know, you still have to say what it looks like. And really, that's the reason for the current cosmological theory, which also has been disproved. But the problem with a theory in organized science, especially today, is that if you have no other theory, you're stuck with the one you have. There are reasons for this which go. The explanation for that, I would have to say, is a bit difficult to plumb because it has to do with the way societies organize themselves and it in the impact on science or the interaction between science and society, that you do need to have some way of answering the recurrent, really continuous question that human beings can be expected to ask. Once a society is aware, that is made conscious, that there are answers to their questions, this is the whole instinct of a scientifically oriented human, is to get logical answers to human questions. Well, the main one for a human who comes of age is, where did I come from? Where did we, that is humans, come from? How do you trace back the origin of human beings? That's the primary question. A second question, strongly related, if not identical, is the question of, where did this ecology originate? How did it originate? Now, Darwinism itself cannot answer that question. It's a separate question. All Darwin answered was, how did the species diversify? And from his observation of finches' beaks and other diversification evidence, he came up with a rational guess. The problems that he listed in his Problems with the Theory chapter, chapter 6 of that famous book, was basically just one. Just one. And it was very well formulated. He listed, although only once, he only did this once, but he did it. So he did admit the weakness in his theory. And what did he observe? He gave an example of what he observed. It was simply the human eyeball. And you can look up that quote. I won't attempt to quote it from memory, although I probably should have memorized it by now. Basically, he said that the complexity cannot be described at all by evolution. That there's no way that evolution describes the complexity of an organism, a cellular organism, of the order of structure of the mammals. This would not be just man, but a mammalian eyeball. He forthrightly and honestly stated that evolution cannot explain that. Even though he knew nothing about DNA, he perceived, he intuited correctly that the level of complexity to achieve such a thing as an eyeball, which is just representative of all the organs and the coherence of the skeletal and vascular and neurological systems that are common to mammals, that these cannot be explained at all by evolution, because even with any form of coordinated genetic change, whose mechanism was totally unknown to Darwin, he had no idea how this could have happened. He was simply pointing out that it looked like the species had diversified. That is something that not even the creationists could answer. So this has remained a mystery, and it looks like it always will. I will simply offer my own viewpoint on it, since I'm one of the only men capable of achieving a higher level of rational evaluation of the theory. Because as far as I can tell, everyone else is just brainwashed out of their minds. I would like to diverge and tell you what I mean by that, how I know that. But first, I want to complete the thought. That Darwin knew that his theory of the diversification of species could not possibly explain the complexity of the resultant ecology, even in terms, as he limited himself to this observation, that even the complexity of one typical mammal, which he would include humans there because they're obviously not birds or fish or reptiles, were mammalian. That there is no explanation for that even under his theory. So it was a provisional theory that simply pointed out there is strong evidence for diversification of species, and the diversification merely of the finches of the Galapagos Islands establishes a prima facie case that cannot be denied, that some sort of diversification took place, but that directly implies that there had to be a mechanism of change, and we know now that there's none. That leaves the question open then. Given that there's no mechanism of genetic change, and yet we have direct evidence, or very strongly suggestive evidence, of the diversification of species, how, for instance, did the finches diversify? You could say specify. There must have been, or I would have to say, there's no other choice but to assume there had to be a proto-finch that have had one locked code, and then something unlocked the code. Well, that's not in the Bible. That is not in the Bible anywhere. And so we have to extrapolate. What I've found is there's really only one way to extrapolate that. But here is where I'm afraid even I wander into treacherous quicksand. And I think you'll notice that when I give you my impression of the current best guess of how humans emerged. That's the first question. But the second one is strongly related. How do species diversify at all? And extrapolating on that to connect the two thoughts, just talking about finches, that's one level of diversification. You could say there was a proto-finch, you're forced to that observation, and on the Galapagos Islands, the finches over the generations diversified without there being a mechanism for it. There is none. It's not that we haven't discovered the mechanism, it's that there is none. So, I mean, unless you're willing to go supernatural, you don't have any answer. But the whole meaning of science, according to the Einsteinian principle, which I insist is the basic principle of science, that we must get these answers. And if we can't get them, we're forced to guess. And that leads to problems. Because in science, you can never guess. If you do guess, you have to say that you're guessing. That's called a theory. But alas, there is no such demarcation any longer between what is called a theory and what can be proved. In other words, we have at least 3 main models now, dominating science and dictating how science is meant to project itself and go forward. There is always a framework, a theoretical framework of some kind at the cutting edge. Now, without bringing up the other 2 main models, which is the standard model of particle physics and the standard model of cosmological origin, those are the 2 other dominant theories. But this one is the one that humans need to know about first. We all ask this question, where am I from? You as an individual, where are you from? Well, you can try to trace it back, and here's the nature of my answer. You can trace it back, but not strictly scientifically. There is no scientific answer. What we're looking for is a logical answer of some kind, because we have to have one. That's the whole point of science, is to have some kind of logical framework for answering here the particular question that needs to be answered at the top of the list. There is no other question that humans have ever asked that's more important in science than the origin of life. And as I began to say, Darwinian evolution does not address the origin of life. So if you wanted to begin to address this question in some way, you might want to go right back to where did life come from on Earth. And then you have to observe what you already know from science. We do know that there is no such thing as genetic diversification. It can't happen. There's no possible mechanism unless it's supernatural. Okay, and so that ends the first half of our exploration of the origin of the human race. In the next lecture, we will complete our scientific investigation of that question to get the answer. We must replace the model that currently exists for the origin of human beings because it has been disproved, and now we need the correct theory. We'll do better than that. Stay tuned. This is Anagalactic. We'll be right back.